What's going on, everybody? Welcome to week 6 of Filter Through Skin. Today I'm here with the one and only Patrick Walters. This is a very exciting interview for me. As I've said in previous weeks, for those of you who may be watching this in the distant future and not a part of the program, a lot of the poets that I've been interviewing, we run in the same kind of social circles because we've been doing this for so long professionally. Patrick, however, I would say is a special case of that. Patrick and I have been doing poetry together since 2014.
Yeah,
when
13.
we 2013. Yeah, because we were competing in 2013 together. That's crazy. And we made the 2014 team.
Full on 10 years.
Yo, that's crazy. Full on 10 years of practice and for a short while competition. We were in a collective together called The Uncharted. We opened for the Roots together.
Man,
We wrote things for libraries and
we have like several lifetimes of experience.
Yeah, it's been a beautiful, beautiful process. And I deeply appreciate Patrick's friendship, and I deeply appreciate his artistry. I say his artistry especially because there are so many people who commit to craft, and then they kind of like they stay where they are. They don't commit to their growth. But when I say this man is committed to the form, married to the form, I truly mean that. And I don't meet people often cut from the same cloth in that way, where like money obviously matters, but I think it's a handful of people. David DeLisca is one of them. Fatima Muhammad is one of them. Desiree McKenzie is one of them. Shelly's one of them. And that's why I'm in alignment with all of these people. But like, we can't not be this. And Patrick's work as an individual artist is amazing. His work as an arts educator is amazing. And I'm deeply appreciative, I think, of Patrick's style being rooted in his, obviously, like your roots from St. Kitts and all of that work, but also in your own personal experience here and how you've deeply blended the two works.
There's so much on the bone, so it's just like evergreen content to
Mhm.
talk about.
So I'm gonna allow you to introduce yourself, and then we'll move from there.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much, Josh, for bringing me onto this project. As I was telling you earlier, Filter Through Skin is one of my favorite projects every year. I think it's one of the most important workshops in the city right now, to be honest with you. I think that the work that we do as artists is not only important now, but it sets the tone for a generation to come. And you can't really put a price or a value on that. So thank you for being consistent. Thank you for showing up for these young people all the time and giving them a platform to express themselves, because that's very important and isn't done enough. A lot of the programs in the city right now are so generic because money is so hard to come by. So everyone is just like, a poetry program, a music program, this will work, this will get me a grant. But the specificity of this program, the fact that you're not just teaching how to write, but how to write from a certain perspective of shared and lived experiences as young Black people, is extremely important, beneficial, and it's necessary work. So thank you for being the one to do it, and thank you for allowing me to come on and contribute to the program as well. I'm excited to get going.
Thanks, man. We're going to hop right into it. As you know, when we're doing these interviews in person, I'm just pulling the curtain down. There's no sort of illusion. This will not be pretty on the thing. You're going to see the little
We are pretty, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
The video itself
is going to be, it's going to be what it is. Exactly. So we're talking this week as we go through Filter Through Skin, writing from a place of understanding, knowing the roots of the work. This workshop is, I would say, unintentionally, but unironically named after some of the work I did with Dwayne, coming up from the roots. For those of you who don't know who Dwayne Morgan is, seeing this outside of the program, if you're in my program and don't know who Dwayne Morgan is, you and I have issues, and I don't understand how you know me. But the idea of knowing where you come from is so important, and the idea of knowing what was before you, not even just where you come from, because we all come from different diasporic roots and, may have different experiences nationally or internationally. So I don't expect everyone to know everything about where they come from. I most certainly don't. But I do think it's important to be willing to look back and fully understand the history of a situation. And knowing your roots, I think, is imperative. Knowing your roots, and I say that again in terms of like contextual situations, not just your history, is so important because it allows us to speak not just from a place of passion, but from a place of understanding. And one of the things I appreciate a lot about Patrick's poetry, Patrick knows a lot about history as a person, just regularly.
A fan of history in general, yeah.
And one of the things I've come to appreciate over the years from Patrick's work is that he is very, very thorough in making sure that if he's exploring a situation, he understands what he's talking about. And I think I'm of a similar cloth. I don't like writing about things I don't know. And when I write about things I don't know, I'm in community with people who can page me and say, like, you need to go back and re-explore this. You need to go back and figure out what it is you have to say. So I guess in my very long ranty 2-minute lead up to this question is, where do you find the importance of research in the work that you write?
So before I even research, I think there's a set of criteria that I want to be able to meet before I even go into my research. I think that, first of all, this has to be a topic that I am passionate about outside of my research. So if I'm talking about, for example, the water crisis in First Nations areas, I need to check for myself where that's coming from. Am I writing about this topic because I'm passionate about it, because I feel a certain verve to talk about this? Or am I writing it because it's hot button or popular discourse within the communities and circles that I might find myself in, right? If the answer is the latter, then it doesn't qualify. If the answer is that I think that this is a hot button topic that I am maybe loosely familiar with, but not super passionate, but it's very popular and a lot of people are talking about it, it doesn't meet the criteria of me giving it any further room or power, because that's someone else's story. You know, for example, I'll give you an example of something that I would love to research or talk about one day, but it's not my story. The makeup industry for women, right? And people in general. That is a story that I'm passionate about, but again, not my story. And I need to make sure that whenever I'm presenting something, A, it's my story, and B, I have the passion in order to go back and research and find out even more about why it's my story. And then once it's met the criteria of research or of being explored further, then I go into like, okay, what's the angle here? What are the specifics of the situation that people will not know about?
Yeah.
Because there's no point me just like giving you back a historical retelling of something that we all know about.
Yeah.
You know, not only have those stories been explored already, but at the same time, they will lose a certain level of resonance with the audience if you are not sharing with them something that they previously did not have access to. So, for example, we spoke about the King's African Defense poem that I wrote back in the day. And one of the main reasons why I went that route with that poem is because of the fact that I wanted to make sure that this is something that people will not have a previous connection with, right? And therefore, it allows me carte blanche to really paint a picture and give them the full scene without them saying that didn't happen, that doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing that? Why are you saying that? Right? Because they have a general idea of the civil rights movement in the late 50s, 60s, and early 70s. But if I'm just starting everything under that umbrella, I can pick out stories, I can pick out experiences and ways of telling the story that most people will not have thought about before, because they haven't done the research and they don't know the intricacies of the details that is not available to everyone else.
Yeah. All right. So to dive back into context, you were just talking about the King's African defense. And if I remember correctly, the poem was named after King's Indian defense, a move that
an opening set in poetry, in chess, that many grandmasters use as like a so for context, the title is the King's African Defense. The reason I chose that was because the opening of the if you're familiar with chess, there's many different types of openings, and one of the openings that is very popular in chess is called the King's Indian Defense, and that's the actual opening that was used in the game that I'm referencing, the World Championship between I think is Evgeny Malkin, Russian player, and Bobby Fischer, who's a multiple time American and world champion. And I switched the name because King's African Defense, as I kind of like used it to speak about African American and North American African relations throughout 50s, 60s, 70s to present day as well.
Mhm. And so I think one of the important things when we're writing about history is based in concrete fact. And a lot of people find history boring or to be irrelevant when it comes to art because they don't quantify the two of them being parable.
Right.
Where I think biopics are the closest thing we get to history and art regularly intersecting. Or docs. And in poetry, I find it really fascinating. So you used all of the chess moves from the game to describe historical events, attaching dates from the civil rights movement. And I guess my question for you as an artist, because we want to bridge this into artistry, is how do you bridge the gap between history and artistic form and make those so that they come together in an enjoyable piece?
That's a great question. The reason that that's a great question, in my opinion, is because there is art in everything. Everything is art, and in my opinion, everything is poetry. So history is poetry because poetry tells us a story of where we've been and where we're going. In the same way that history tells us where we've been and where we're going. And so there's actually quite a lot of duality and a lot of comparison that me personally, I draw a lot of comparison between history and art. I think that history gets a bad rap because it's already happened and we can't change it and we feel like we can't interpret it anything other than what actually was what it was. But what you realize is that two things actually. First of all, history is always interpretable because the people who wrote history in the first place, they were interpreting their experiences.
Yeah.
And reality is subjective. Therefore, history is subjective. Therefore, there's no such thing as like, oh, this is concrete fact. You got to go back and feel like, and look back and say, okay, yes. For example, Tupac was shot and died. That's one of the things that I reference in the piece. He did die. The circumstances around it are what they are. However, our interpretation of those instances, what that means for the future, is the subjective part, right? So, if, in my opinion, that was a terrible thing that happened for the Black community, the artist community. So many different communities lost one of their champions when Tupac was killed. But then I'm sure that there's a lot of other people who are either indifferent or don't think that it played such a huge role in the shaping of where we are today as a culture or a community. So for me, you have to really like remove the ideas, the preconceived notion that history is not malleable. History is very malleable, and it just depends how you are willing to interpret it. That really can set the tone for the future or like where you are right now. Going back to that chess thing as well, from that standpoint, people look at the chess moves and they're like, okay, the chess moves are the chess moves. They don't change. But my interpretation of what the chess moves means is what brings the poem to life.
Absolutely.
Right. So if I'm unable to interpret correctly what the moves mean, the poem doesn't even work.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes my creativity or my brain to give life to something that otherwise was just a historical fact, and that's where the art comes in.
Beautiful.
It's about us
Great
finding
answer.
what that historical significance is about.
Absolutely. We stopped because technology, and we don't want to risk losing this gorgeous interview. But we were talking about how uh, Patrick was saying he's passionate about viewing history as art
Yeah.
and art as history. And I think as we interpret our lives, because we do that actively,
Yeah.
you're giving me a lot to think about in the realm of interpretation being a driving mechanism of how we create art
Mm-hmm.
and how we understand our world in historical context. Even thinking
Exactly.
about if we're writing about, I remember when I wrote King, I wrote this as someone who studied Dr. Martin Luther King's life
Yes.
in great detail. And one of the things that always frustrated me when I was doing my research about civil rights movement was that people presented him purely as a pacifist,
Right.
and almost as being in full support of the nation he was a part of.
Right.
But by the end of his life, he was like, "We're integrating into a burning house.
Right.
This is not a good country.
No.
We have to directly upend the socio-economic system that exists for us to even have a shot at equality in this country." And while they were going to kill him for the other stuff before, that's ultimately why he died, because he was shifting towards communism, and to much more aggressive stances than people are willing to admit. He was a pacifist for himself, but he did believe that his methods weren't entirely effective. And when people do the contrast of him and Malcolm X, for instance, they were very much almost the same by the end of their lives.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about interpreting history and our lives in the moment, I think it's important for us to contextualize, as poets, all of us, that our work is an interpretation of the times always. Our work, whether we're speaking about love or we're speaking about, you know, what the powers that be are, whether they're making commentaries on art, all of it is real-time evaluation of our circumstance.
And real-time evaluation of history.
Mm-hmm.
We are currently evaluating the history that we are experiencing right now.
Amazing. So I think I want to talk a little bit about interpretation and the even in this moment right now. This is getting very meta. This is why I love talking to you so much. The idea that even right now, you and I are contextualizing the moment that we exist in, the time frame that we exist in. Where, in terms of interpreting history and looking at what has happened in the past or what is happening in the present, how do you measure your bias to create the most honest piece of art for yourself? I'm not saying to create the most historically accurate piece of art, but how do you properly evaluate your own bias so that you are bringing forth the most honest version of your recounting of events?
So, first of all, it has to meet the criteria that I outlined prior to, with regards to being both something that I'm passionate about, something that is able to be researched in my current state, and then also a story that is relevant to me that I feel I have the qualification to speak about in general. If it meets all three of those, then I can start to contextualize where I'm coming from, where I'm meeting it from a historical context, right? I make sure that there's always a certain level of intro that I give people, because everyone has a base level of understanding. For example, your poem about Martin Luther King Jr. He, you are aware that everyone has a base level understanding of Dr. King's ideology, his thoughts, and stuff like that. But what you are curious about in that situation is the things that people don't know about that you can add to historical context, right? These things have already happened. Everything that you're speaking about in a situation like that is already taking place. However, the way that you interpret it for your own art and the way that you present it to your audience can be whatever you want that to be. And that to me is where the beauty of contextualizing a historical event and then doing the research to further your understanding of that event can be really powerful for yourself as an artist.
Mm-hmm. So we evaluate. Thank you for that answer. We speak about understanding where the historical event has happened in our place and proximity to it. We talk about the taking up of, am I passionate enough about this? Is this my story to tell? And then I think where I start to, are you hearing that echo slightly?
Yes.
All right, cool. As long as you're hearing it too,
Okay.
I don't feel crazy.
You're not going
I think
wow, being so harsh.
The beauty of being able to look at these things and acknowledge these things and walk through these things for ourselves is that we present ourselves with the opportunity, once we understand our biases and understand the point of where we're going. How do you, I guess, to continue to be concise, where do you decide in a poem is the best direction for you to go? Like, are you forming these historical pieces to arrive at a certain conclusion about history? Are you constructing these pieces to arrive at a certain conclusion about the future, the present? Where do you write historical research pieces from? I would say, where do you hope to end up?
That's a great question, and I think the answer to that question is can evolve based off of the type of research that I want to do, or the historical situation that occurred. Um, if it's a historical situation that is very close to me, for example, I have poetry that shares about when I was 13 years old and I got robbed. Technically, that's a historical event, right? And I'm sharing that story, and I don't necessarily need to do quote unquote research for that. But at the same time, there are a lot of socioeconomic factors that contributed to me being 13 years old and getting robbed. So what are those? What are they? And how does that play into the emotion of me feeling at my most vulnerable? Again, going back to King's African Defense, that one is actually obviously a bit more complicated, because I'm not only am I sharing my own personal experience, I'm relating it back into the idea of a chess match. And I knew the outcome of the chess match before the writing, right? You knew that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated before you started writing, right? And so we have the idea of this historical event culminates with this. However, again, going back to what I was saying before, history is about interpreting it, right? And so therefore, if I want to have a positive spin, I can have a positive spin. If I want to have a negative spin, or whatever, nostalgic spin, or maybe unanswered like question looming in the air, then I can do that. And I think the intention and the idea and the emotion that you come to the poem with is something that people will resonate with regardless of the historical event. So it's less, the historical event is more of a backdrop, a setting the scene for your ideology to take place within that historical event.
Nice.
Because everyone knows what happened, but they don't know how it happened and why it happened. And those are the questions that you can fill in the blanks for people. And if you do a good job of it, then the historical event doesn't matter so much as the message that you're using it for, right? So you didn't write King with the intention of just relaying Dr. King's life to people who's in the audience listening to your poetry. I didn't write King's African Defense to merely showcase, a chess match that happened in the World Championships. That was just a backdrop for the message that I wanted to put forward in the first place, which is why I was saying earlier that the criteria has to be met in terms of passion and researchability in order for me to go ahead and do that, because ultimately the history is just my interpretation of it, and the story that I'm telling is much larger than the singular historical event that I'm referencing.
Mm-hmm. We're going to keep going. This is so I want to shift gears a little bit, but still bridging off kind of the energy of what you shared. When we begin to speak about our personal reference points and where we draw from in history, I like to think a lot about, for you and I, we think about our Caribbean heritage. I think about Jamaica, you think about St. Kitts. And so much of my, I've actually, because of my stance on not writing about things I am not truly informed on, I don't write much about my roots in that regard.
Right.
One of the only poems I've written, truly knowing the historical context, because I understand the tactics of slave owners and all of that stuff, is writing about homosexuality and writing about homophobia
Yeah.
and the religious context
Yeah.
specifically of Jamaica's stance on gay people and queer people, and being able to write that from relating it rooted from a Jamaican Canadian perspective, rooting it there and then tracing the story back and understanding the history behind where that comes from and why I can condemn it, but not without also highlighting the socioeconomic and religious, spiritual things that happened in history.
Right.
When we are looking at historical events in real time, so for me, it was a measured response against queerphobia, but also a measured stance against white historical amnesia.
Yeah.
Where do we,
And the long-term effects of colonialism,
and the long-term effects of colonialism, and understanding that these things are deeply interlinked.
Yeah.
When we write these poems, the beauty of research, I find, is you come to better understand not just the issue or the subject you're exploring, but you also come to a better understanding of yourself and your community. And you're able to do the work you do with much more compassion. And I'm able to condemn things in my culture without hating my culture and without denoting my culture. And so I think for you, the question I want to pose is, how does history inform how does historical understanding, not just history, how does historical understanding and context inform the ways in which you write and who you write for?
So I think that historical understanding is basically understanding where you are in all of that history, right? What is your place in the things that you are talking about? So going back to your example of the poem that you wrote about queerphobia in Jamaica, but also the Caribbean in general, due to colonialism and the religious backgrounds of most Caribbean countries due to colonialism. You also are a religious and spiritual person. So I think that that poem would not have been accessible to you if you were not also spiritual and religious, in addition to being Jamaican or having Jamaican background, right? So both of those criteria had to be met. Not just I am from Jamaican heritage, but I am from Jamaican heritage, I live in Canada, and I am a spiritual person. If you were not a spiritual person, it would have been almost impossible, in my opinion, for you to really tackle what that means, right? Because you are truly understanding the nuance of, it's okay to believe in a deity or a higher power, but it's not okay to enforce those beliefs on other people who have their own lives to live. And if they should choose to come to that by themselves, then that's great, but don't force it upon them. And don't make it illegal to do anything else, right? And so when you understand that context, it's like, okay, I am actually uniquely suited to speak about this idea, right? And so my historical context is what am I specifically uniquely qualified and uniquely in a position where I can speak about this, right? I'm a huge fan of chess. I played chess regularly for years, and if I didn't, I would have no ability to properly contextualize that game that I'm talking about. If I wasn't a product of Caribbean living for my whole entire life, I would not be able to speak about the idea of coming to Canada and experiencing all these new culture shock things that I had to go through when I first came here, right? Even something as simple as the concept of BYOB, the bring your own beer. Like that's not even a Caribbean thing. That's not even a Caribbean concept or idea. And that's something that I was very interested in talking about, because I realized like this is completely different. This historical context that everyone else around me is having, I'm so foreign to that, right? But again, that tension, that little bit of gnawing away at like the tension in the situation of me being new to Canada, but Canada being new to me as well. Like them having to understand me as an immigrant, but also me an immigrant to Canada as well. That tension right there is where the art is, right? You understanding that you are Jamaican, but you're also a spiritual person. That conflict is where the art actually is. That little piece right there is actually where the art is. And so you find that, and then you find the poem.
Word. That's beautiful. I love it. Okay, so I think my last question to kind of bring this to a wrap is, we're talking about, and you'll obviously be teaching a workshop that'll be for the people in this program. But for those watching, what would you say is a good medium or a good place to start for doing research? Research is so tricky in this day and age. With mass amounts of misinformation,
So much.
and the interpretation of information. And I think there's room for looking at things outside of the mainstream understanding. That's one thing about research. You can and we're doing this for poetry, and we're doing this for historical records. So I'm not talking about like medical research or like physics.
Unless there's art there.
Unless there's art there. Yes, because then you can research that as well. I did a little bit of research to understand entropy before writing about it.
There you go. And that's part of it, part of the whole thing.
I would say, where do you, when writing about, we'll stick to our own.
Okay.
So when I write about Jamaica, when you write about St. Kitts, if someone who is in this audience wants to write about Nigeria or Somalia or Eritrea or wherever they come from on the motherland or across the diaspora, what would you say is the you can give as many steps as you want or as few steps as you want, but where would you say you start in terms of research?
I think to best answer that question, I would say you have to start general and then get specific. So if you are researching about, let's say, for example, the American government overthrowing the Grenadian government back in 1970 and destabilizing the nation. Let's use that as an example, right? You start with what happened, but then the research that you're doing is how the people experienced that situation. And then therefore how you now experience that situation because of the ramifications all these years later, right? Let's give another example. Let's say you don't want to talk about a historical event. Let's say I want to talk about St. Kitts as it currently is, right? There's a certain level of broadness that I have to bring everybody into my situation. Because if you're researching a topic and you start off with the most small granular details, people will not be able to access on a grand scale what it is you're referencing, because you started too granular in the beginning. So start wide in the beginning. My advice is start wide in the beginning, cast a wide net, and then specialize after you found the thing. Because what will happen is, if you cast a wide enough net, something will click for you. That's like, ooh, let me run down that rabbit hole of information there, right? Let me figure out this little thing that actually plays a part in this whole larger thing that I'm talking about. Because if you can make people have that connection to a small detail of a large event, that is where people really love what you have to say about art, because or in your poem, because they have been taken to a journey of a general idea that they already knew about, but you have taken that general idea that they know about, and you have gone a step deeper or two steps deeper in terms of your understanding, but also expanding their knowledge. And people love when you expand their knowledge about something that they were already passionate about. So if you're talking about something that was already passionate to people, or you made it passionable or passionate to people, and then you add another layer of like, this is why it's relevant to you specifically right now, that's where you got people hooked.
Amazing. We're at 4 minutes, but I think we have just enough time left to say thank you. I appreciate you sharing. I appreciate your patience with the room transitions.
We made it. We made it.
But I think the beauty of this interview specifically is that there's so much to be found in how we approach our where we've come from.
Yeah.
And where we've come from always leads to where we're going, but the being able to function in the middle of that,
Yeah.
and being able to look around and say, this is my place, and here's how you can see your place.
Yeah. And being in love with the process, I think, is very important as well. Like, you asked about how you would begin getting into the research. Don't shy away from the process. Don't shy away from the process. Embrace the process of research and understanding, because that is where the best beautiful art is.
All right. Until next time, thank you so much for coming to Filter Through Skin. We will see you at the workshop, I guess.
Yes, sir.